There is a particular kind of quiet that only old hospitals have. Not the quiet of an empty house, and not the quiet of a church after the last car is pulled out of the lot. It's a working quiet, if that makes any sense. The kind of silence that used to have a pulse in it, a hum of gurneys and radiators, and somebody screaming 2 floors down, and now doesn't. The pulse is gone. What's left is the shape the pulse used to fill. We felt that shape close around us about 4 minutes after we cracked the padlock on the east delivery door of Blackmoor State Hospital, Ward C, the wing they built in 1951 and never really finished tearing down. You want to start a story like this with the file, so we'll start with the file. Blackmoor's administrative records, the ones the state let molder in a strip mall storage unit in Dunmore County, rather than pay to have shredded properly, are a graveyard of triplicate forms, discharge summaries, transfer orders, death certificates, with the cause of death typed so faint you have to hold the paper up to a window to read it, as if even the typewriter ribbon back then didn't want to commit to what it was writing. Of the 411 patients processed through Ward C between 1951 and the state's final closure order in October of 1994, 410 files are closed, stamped, signed, dated, done, filed away like the people themselves were nothing more than paperwork that had finally stopped moving. One file isn't. The name on it doesn't matter. We're not going to give it to you. And if you dig around online looking for it, you're going to end up on message boards full of people who are more interested in being scared than in being right. What matters is that the intake date is March of 1958, and the discharge line is blank. Not filled in and crossed out, not marked deceased. Blank, the way a form is blank before anyone has touched it. Except this form has clearly been touched. It's soft at the corners, the way paper gets soft when a hand keeps coming back to it. We found something else in that storage unit that we didn't expect to find. A line item, still active, in this year's county maintenance budget, $11,000, allocated annually since 1994, under the heading Blackmoor Structural, Ward C. Nobody at the county office could tell us what it was for. The woman who answered the phone actually laughed. Not because it was funny, but because she didn't have anything else to do with her face. "That's just always been there," she said. "Long as I've worked here, we don't ask." That was the first time the hair went up on the back of my neck, and we hadn't even left the parking lot. The building itself agrees with the paperwork in its own way. When we ran the drone over the roofline with thermal, most of Ward C read as a flat, dead gray, no different from the register of a granite headstone, except for one section, second floor, northeast corner. A soft bloom of warmth, faint as a fever, right where the old high-security cells used to be. Something in that building is making heat. Something in that building has been making heat, on and off, for 70 years. The hydrotherapy room is where you always start if you've done this kind of work before, because it's the room that photographs best and the room that tells you the least. Rusted tubs, a ceiling hoist swinging on one bearing, turning in a draft that shouldn't exist in a sealed building. Water damage cascading down the tile in long brown tongues. It was also, on the morning we went in, the only room with actual water in it. Not damage, not a stain, a puddle, ankle shallow, clean enough to throw back a little daylight from the broken skylight above it, and leading out of that puddle, away from the drain, away from every plumbing source in the building that's been dry since Clinton's first term, a trail of wet footprints, bare feet, an adult stride, fresh enough that the edges hadn't started to feather into the dust. We followed them the way you follow anything you can't quite believe you're following, slowly, telling yourself the whole time that there's a rational explanation, that a maintenance worker got in ahead of us, that some kid on a dare left these an hour before we arrived. The footprints didn't care what we told ourselves. They went where they went, out of the hydrotherapy room, down a corridor bone dry for 200 feet in every direction, and into the high-security wing, where the doors are 18-gauge steel with a 9-inch observation slot and nothing else. One of those doors was cracked open. Behind it was not a cell. It had been a cell. You could still see the old bolt sockets where a bed frame used to be chained to the floor, but somebody had turned it into a room. A nest, if you want the honest word. Folded army blankets, laundered soft and smelling faintly of lye soap, the kind nobody's manufactured commercially since Eisenhower. A shelf made from a salvaged gurney rail, holding a scavenged little museum, a 2026 gas station coffee cup, rinsed and reused, a torn corner of a hiking trail map from 3 counties over, a child's plastic dinosaur, the paint mostly worn off, that somebody had clearly held a great many times. It was the coffee cup that did it. You can rationalize old water. You cannot rationalize a coffee cup from a gas station that opened 8 months ago. Somebody was living here. Somebody was living here now. And somewhere in the dark, beyond the beam of our lights, in that particular hush that isn't emptiness, but is instead the sound of something holding very still on purpose, somebody was watching us find that out. Here's what we were able to reconstruct, piecing together the 1958 intake notes. The handwriting cramped, the ink a rust brown that might once have been blue, with what the building itself was willing to tell us. The patient's condition was recorded, in the language of the era, as a morbid dread of open exposure, which is a doctor in 1958 doing his clumsy best to write down what we'd now simply call agoraphobia, so severe it had curdled into something closer to a survival instinct. The notes describe panic, not at leaving the ward, but at the idea of leaving it. The world outside these walls, to this patient, was never freedom. It was the threat. That's the hinge this whole story turns on. And it's worth sitting with, because it isn't what you expect from a haunted asylum tale. This isn't a story about a building that won't let someone go. It's a story about a person who never wanted to be released in the first place, and who, when the state finally stopped watching closely enough to notice, simply declined the invitation to leave. What followed, over decades, in the dark, alone, is a feat of engineering that would be remarkable in a person with full access to hardware stores and contractors, let alone someone we have to assume never once walked into a hardware store. Steam lines from the old central plant, dead to the rest of the building since the 80s, had been rerouted with scavenged pipe fittings to bleed just enough residual heat into that one northeast corner, explaining the thermal bloom we caught from the drone. A jury-rigged array of car batteries and what looked like a decommissioned wind turbine blade, dragged up from a farm auction lot a mile off, gave enough current for a single bulb and, near as we could tell, nothing else. No radio, no signal to the outside world, just enough light to see the walls by. And the walls needed seeing too, because somewhere along the way, the patient had stopped being merely a resident of Ward C and had become its custodian. Cracked joists, shimmed, a collapsing section of roof over the old day room, patched with salvaged tin and tar, invisible from below, barely visible from the drone. Load-bearing brick repointed with mortar mixed, we have to assume, by hand, in the dark, by someone protecting the only home they have ever fully trusted. The hospital didn't keep this person alive. This person kept the hospital standing. You start to notice, the deeper you go, that a building like this doesn't die when the state locks the doors. It just changes what kind of thing lives in it. Behind the old kitchen, in a service yard walled off from the road by 40 feet of collapsed chain link and volunteer sumac, we found a garden. Not a wild tangle of what used to grow here. A garden, rowed, staked, mulched with what looked like shredded newspaper. Tomatoes past their season, the vines pulled and composted properly. Winter greens already in the ground, and around the garden's edge, on the sagging remains of what used to be a smoking patio, small offerings. A bag of rice, still sealed, a child's mitten, clean, folded neatly beside a mason jar of what might have been honey, Nobody local would go on record with us about it. Small towns are like that. They protect their ghosts the way they protect their gossip, jealously and without much logic. But one man at the diner in town, after his second coffee, allowed that. The ward's got somebody looking after it, and folks that know better just leave a little something out, time to time. Same as you'd do for anybody's kin you didn't want going hungry. Whether that's charity, superstition, or a town's collective decision to keep a quiet arrangement quiet, we can't say. What we can say is what we found in the old nurse's station on the second floor. A chair positioned at the one window in the building, with a clear line down the main access road. And beside it, in a shoebox, a stack of index cards, each one dated, each one logging, in that same cramped handwriting from the 1958 intake file. 68 years older now, and shaking with it. Every vehicle, every trespasser, every curious teenager, and ghost hunter, and documentary crew that had ever come up that road. Ours was already in the box, dated that morning, timed to the minute we'd parked. We were not investigating the last patient of Blackmoor State Hospital. We were being processed by them. The footprints ended at a door at the far end of Ward C, iron, riveted. The kind of door 1950s institutional architecture built when it wanted you to understand, in your body, that you were not going anywhere. It was closed, not locked. There was no lock left to turn. Just closed, the way you close a door on a room you don't want anyone else standing in. We stood there long enough that the flashlight beams started to shake a little in our hands, not from cold. Through the vent grill at the bottom of that door, on an exhale that took longer to finish than any breath has a right to, we heard someone breathing, not labored, not frightened, slow, and even and utterly unbothered by our presence 6 feet away. The way you'd breathe in a room you'd owned outright for longer than most of us had been alive. There was a conversation in the hallway after that. Not a loud one. We kept our voices to a whisper, without discussing why, about what you're supposed to do with a discovery like this one. Somebody is living, by choice, inside a condemned building, off a garden and a town's quiet charity, and their own 2 hands, having built themselves, brick by patched brick, the only kind of safety they have ever been able to trust. You could call that a rescue waiting to happen. You could just as easily call it the one dignity the world managed to leave alone. We didn't knock. We didn't call anyone that night, or the next morning, and if that was the wrong call, it's a wrong call we're still willing to defend. Some doors, once you understand what's actually on the other side of them, stop being an investigation and start being a request for privacy. And a person who reroutes steam pipes and repoints load-bearing brick, alone in the dark, for 70 years, has more than earned the right to have that request honored. We packed out before full dark. At the tree line, where the county road bends back toward town, one of us turned around, the way you always do, the way the story always makes you do, and looked back up at that northeast window on the second floor. The light was on, a small, steady, deliberate light, burning in a building the state of has called empty since 1994. Tended by hands the state never bothered to check on again. The file is still open. As far as we could find, it always will be. Nobody's ever coming to close it, and somewhere in Ward C, we don't think anybody's waiting for them to.